According to Václav Havel, the poet, the movement builder, and the former president of Czechoslovakia, hope is not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something makes sense regardless of how it turns out. According to the prophet Joel, fields, don't be afraid, but be joyful and glad because of all the Lord has done for you. Animals, don't be afraid. The pastures are green, the trees bear their fruit, and there is plenty of figs and grapes. Be glad, people of Zion. Rejoice at what the Lord your God has done for you. He has given you the right amount of autumn rain. He has poured down the winter rain for you and the spring rain as before. And then according to Jesus, everyone who makes himself or herself great will be humbled, and everyone who humbles herself or himself will be made great. As I was thinking about coming here this morning, I was thinking that the last time I was with you, we were just about to choose a new Prime Minister. On the 5th of September, I began this bit of the service by alluding to the Conservative Party hustings in Wembley Arena that had taken place 2nd or 3rd of September. That final chance for party members to hear both candidates before choosing a new Prime Minister. Well, that went well, didn't it? So here we are, again, on the threshold of, well, actually, in the threshold of who knows what. And whilst the prophet Joel alludes to that day when our old people will have dreams and our young people will have visions, most of us, I suspect, would just settle for seeing past the end of the week. Oh, what we would give for just a little bit of stability amidst the chaos. And it's Harvest Thanksgiving. That time of year when traditionally we give thanks for the crops having been gathered in safely. And we do rightly give thanks. And we are grateful to the Lord our God for all that God has provided and continues to provide day in, day out, week in, week out, year in, year out. And for some of us, for those who are still able to put our hands in the soil, that Thanksgiving at this time of year continues to feel real and authentic. But for many, many others of us, myself included, it feels a little bit remote. The food that we eat, as we see from this table, often comes more from the corner shop or the supermarket and is available all the year round, and the great majority of it is imported. And as we look at this table, we're seeing the cost of all the things that are on it increase. And some of us are actually frightened about whether we will still be able to afford the things that are on this table. And today, we're collecting for the rising numbers of people in our city who already can't. And so giving thanks to God for the harvest is conflicted, complicated, and no longer necessarily ties in with the seasons. And in this world that we live in, the seasons themselves so often seem out of sync. And then in that Brian Wren hymn that we sang earlier, we give thanks for so much, don't we? That is good and wonderful. But in that verse that we didn't sing and we did talk about, we thank God for the extraction of fossil fuels, stuff that we desperately need. Stuff that 50 years ago our great worry was that we were going to run out of it. And now we know, however we're going to do it, we need to try and keep as much of what is left in the ground. If vast regions of God's beautiful world is not to be destroyed beyond any chance of redemption or rescue. And we recognize that in all probability we may well be beyond the tipping point. That the danger might well already have been done. And there are dire consequences for millions living today and billions living tomorrow. And all of this is before we even get in to the stuff of the rising cost of keeping warm this winter. And thank God for what you are doing here in this place. But keeping warm this winter that we are already experiencing, knowing that for many things are going to get worse. And all of this, my dear friends, is before we face the appalling realities of floods in Pakistan, of famine in Somalia and much of the Horn of Africa, of civil war in Ethiopia, of destruction of life in Ukraine. It's before we face up to the reality that much of the progress made over the last 40 years in tackling extreme poverty, and there has been much progress, is in peril. And that at a time when we desperately need true global thinking and real global leadership, we are apparently turning more and more in upon ourselves. Whether that is as churches, and how much of our conversation of these last few years has been about us, or whether it's about communities, or interest groups, or nations. Sorry, folks, I'm really not doing a very good job of giving reasons for celebrating the harvest, am I? And I'm truly sorry, because there is so much to continue to give thanks for. You and I, we live in a beautiful world where there is more than enough for all and for all of God's creation. Yet we do need to face the reality of the harsh times in which we are living, and not just bury our head in the sand. For if we are to live and flourish, which is what God wants, if we are to live and flourish in these turbulent times, days that resonate with the days of which the prophet Joel spoke, we need to face up to challenges that are real and which lie ahead. And if we are to have dreams that turn to God-inspired action and visions that lighten the path, we need to know where we are, here and now, where we want to go, and we need, with God's grace and God's help and the wisdom of others, to try to get there. This stuff of thanksgiving cannot be about starry-eyed optimism, but has to somehow be about facing reality and digging deep into gospel hope. Our gospel reading might seem a strange place to start to dig, but it's as good a place as anywhere. Picture the scene. There is a Pharisee and a tax collector. And in line with the practices of their times, they both spoke out loud their private prayers so that others might hear them. Now that's an interesting thought, isn't it? For us, our private prayers we say in secret. But in Jesus' day, private prayers were spoken out loud. So as in a way you were accountable to one another for the conversation that you had with God. But the fact that they both spoke their prayers out loud, that's where the similarities between those two prayers ended. One of them extolled his own virtues and pointed the blame elsewhere. The other lamented their failings and recognized the need to be transformed. How easy it is to blame others for the mess we've got ourselves into. How easy it is to say we think all this stuff going on in the world, or all this fossil fuel extraction has to end, but we're unwilling to give up our way of living. Now, unlike many of Jesus' parables, and this one occurs only in Luke, but unlike many of Jesus' parables, this one doesn't actually require layers of unpicking before you get to the point. It's pretty straightforward, isn't it? It's about hypocrisy, about exposing those who think too highly of themselves, of exposing those who point the finger at others rather than pointing back at themselves. And it's about the affirmation of those who, no matter their station in life, and being a tax collector then as now wasn't that popular a job, recognize their failings and are thrown back onto mercy and forgiveness from others. Remember, he spoke his prayer out loud, as well as from God. However, just because it's easy to understand doesn't mean that it's easy to hear. Because hypocrisy is always easier to see in others. And humbling ourselves before others and before God is always easier to talk about than to actually do. So I stand before you as someone whose father helped to design the pipeline that brought oil from the Forties field in the North Sea to Grangemouth Oil Refinery. And although I don't believe for a minute that my dad knew the damage that that oil might do to the planet, still I recognize our collective complicity. But I also stand as someone who tends to forget my commitment to eat less meat when I'm faced with a really nice looking steak. As someone who speaks out against poverty day after day after day, and yet can earn more in a day than most people might earn in a month. I stand before you as someone who is often critical of the employment practices of a certain unnamed delivery company, but it doesn't stop me using them when I want a book in a hurry. I stand here as someone who, probably just like everyone else in this room, finds myself addicted to the benefits of fossil fuels. And so if we are ever to find our way out of the tough realities that we're in, we need to begin by, like the tax collector, acknowledging our failings, individually and collectively, and to recognize the price of those failings or choices, intended or not. There's a growing call from the global south for those of us who benefited from the wealth generated in the years since the Industrial Revolution to pay back some of what we've benefited. It's a cry for justice, and it needs to be heard. Christian Aid is running a petition at the moment entitled Hack the Agenda, that many feel is important to be getting behind. But friends, let's not leave the story this harvest day in a space of guilt and simply in the need for reparations. For the gospel of love, the gospel of hope, is bigger than that. It must be bigger than that. For guilt alone cannot change us. We need this harvest morning to try to discover, to recover a sense of hope. Not naive hope. Not wringing our hands in bleak despair either. To recover instead gospel hope, A gospel hope that is rooted in God, the Creator, is revealed to us in Jesus, the Redeemer, and is possible for us through the power of the Spirit, the Inspirer. To believe that because God is love, fields, animals, and people will continue to flourish. To believe not that we can somehow change the course of history, but that whatever is happening in this history of which we are a part, God is also a part of it. And that this is God's world. The decision to live and to act hopefully, not because things will naturally turn out well, but because doing what needs to be done is actually the only way to truly live. According to the prophet Joel, fields, don't be afraid, but be joyful and glad because of all the Lord has done for you. Animals, don't be afraid. The pastures are green, the trees bear their fruit, and there is plenty of figs and grapes. Be glad, people of Zion, people of Jerusalem. Rejoice at what the Lord your God has done for you. He has given you the right amount of autumn rain. He's poured down the winter rain for you, and the spring rain as before. And according to Jesus, everyone who makes himself or herself great will be humbled. But hear this, everyone who humbles herself or himself will be made great. And then finally, to return to where we began, and to these words of Václav Havel. Hope is not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something makes sense, regardless of how it turns out. Let's go and live that hope as we give thanks for the harvest, and as we commit ourselves to being part of God's ongoing redemption and salvation of all creation. Amen.